let's kick off with your LBC colleague Nick Ferrari's interview
Yes.
with Keir Starmer earlier today.
Well, very interesting. And as ever, when you get raw and unfiltered members of the public, you get some very difficult moments. And I thought there were two areas where Keir Starmer really struggled a bit. One, not surprisingly, is on ruling out council tax, further ruling out of taxation. That's been the Tory playbook all the way through. And the other one is over his in support for Jeremy Corbyn back in the day. And on both occasions, he's just sounded uneasy and unhappy. Certainly on my LBC show and in the New Statesman, week after week after week, we highlight things like child poverty, the really dire state of the NHS, the filthy condition of British rivers, the crumbling prisons and court system, the woeful condition of the British armed forces. And we all know that all of those things need to be rebuilt. And we know that the next government is going to be a rebuilding government. And so the proposition that this can be done without money is farcical. I'm going to vote Labour, and I would expect to be taxed more as a result. I don't quite know where, but somewhere I would expect to be paying more taxes, possibly quite a bit more taxes, in order to resolve some of the things I myself have been complaining about for the last 10 years. So it's gross hypocrisy to be surprised by this. I think the big mistake that Labour has made is over the last year not to constantly make the case for higher spending and constantly point out that where the Conservatives are pursuing austerity level spending and worse across the public realm, things are literally falling apart. I think the public know this. They can see, they look around, they understand this, and therefore I think they should have been bolder months ago, but it's too late now.
And polling suggests that the public are very much with you on this as well. They recognise that in order to fix all these things that are broken, there has to be money, there has to be investment.
The Labour Party is kind of scarred and wounded by previous contests, and they simply think the public are being hypocritical. The public will tell people like you and me in polls or in focus groups or whatever that want higher public spending, and in the privacy of the ballot box, when facing a higher tax bill, will always vote Conservative. That's what Labour thinks, and who knows, they may have a point. I just think they have left themselves open to the constant charge of you are going to have to raise taxes. And it sticks because it's true. I mean, they come in and maybe 20 or 30 local authorities around the country are on the edge of bankruptcy, as Anush Chakelian, our colleague, has been reporting on. Are they just going to let them go under, or are they going to do something about it? And so on, and so on, and so on.
And you've talked before particularly about the rebanding of council tax as one example, and it keeps coming up. It came up this morning on LBC. That's actually, it's one of the most regressive taxes that we have. There's a strong argument there for a progressive, even centrist, but left of centre party to make a good argument for the rebanding.
Exactly. That's the lack of radicalism in this campaign, I'm sure we've talked about before and will again. But, it's not just that nothing has been done for so long on council tax banding, and therefore the great big changes in property prices have been completely missed out of this. It's also that this is, in effect, a tax which is paid by people in the north and the poorer areas of England to almost subsidise people in the south, exactly the wrong way around, which is why somebody like Andy Burnham talks about it a lot. He knows that a proper look again at council tax, look again at rebanding, would in effect squirt money from the rich south back up to the still not very rich north. That's why Labour won't talk about it, because they're thinking of voters in both places.
Is there an argument that it's a kind of levelling up, actually?
You could use that phrase, Hannah. Why not?
The other area where Keir Starmer looked very uncomfortable and sounded very uncomfortable was when he was asked about Jeremy Corbyn, similarly to when Beth Rigby asked him about
Absolutely.
This Sky.
I think the reason he looked so uncomfortable was that it points to an inconvenient truth, which today's politicians can't really be open about. We have a party system which depends, in an election like this, on big forces being massed around single leaders in order to try to win a parliamentary majority and govern the country. Now, to get that, party leaders have to bring their parties towards the centre, towards an election. And that requires lots of, indecorous, ungainly, rather ugly-looking behaviour. It does require telling lies from time to time. It does require prevarication, and it does require keeping your head down. We have this idea that politics is a great noble business where you stand on a platform and you talk truth to the people, you talk truth to power, and everybody...
I think many people would disagree.
Well, This is what we like to
Yes,
think, you know, and people sob at the back with emotion and people applaud and all the rest of it. A lot of politics is keeping your head down and dodging and weaving towards where you need to get to. Now, I think the truth is that Starmer stayed in Corbyn's cabinet, shadow cabinet, because he realised that if he wanted to be leader and take the Labour Party to where he needed to be, he had to be part of the leadership group. He couldn't just be a backbencher. And also, he thought that he could influence Corbyn in a pro-European direction, which he did a little bit. But by and large, it was an unheroic and unglamorous period in his life where he was keeping his head down and trying to, get to the position where he could win, which he then did. And he made those alleged pledges. They should never have been pledges. He should never have pledged to nationalise things he didn't want to nationalise or raise taxes if he didn't think he could raise taxes. They should not have been pledges. But this is part of getting the Labour Party to a position where we are now, where it looks like almost certainly the next government, which is an extraordinary political achievement. And after all, Rishi Sunak kept his head down under Boris Johnson until right at the last minute when he realised it was all over and bravely jumped over the top, when the machine guns had ceased firing. He was kept his head down quite a lot during the worst of the Truss moment because he wasn't quite sure if it was going to work or not. And it was only after the disaster had been a disaster that he was brave enough to come and, brave Sir Rishi runs away. So, they all do it. But they can't admit it.
But what? So he was asked 8 times by Nick Ferrari if he would have served under a Corbyn as Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. He swerved it.
Had they won, would you have accepted a post in Mr Corbyn's cabinet?
I don't think we were going to win. I don't think anybody thought we were going
You're a very bright
to win.
man. You know that's not answering the question, Sir Keir.
What is the least worst outcome for Keir Starmer in answering that question? Should he be honest? Should he, anything he does is not going to look great, is it?
I
the truth is, he probably would have, wouldn't he? Because he would have been in power.
I would have given the following answer. In the exceedingly unlikely event of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, I would have been in his cabinet fighting to change his position on NATO, fighting to change some of his taxation proposals. I would have been a really difficult, stroppy and embarrassing member of his cabinet if I'd had to be. It wouldn't have happened, but that's what I've had to do. But let me tell you, Nick, I'm now channeling what I think he should have said. I am absolutely covered. I look like a confident chap in spectacles and hoping to win this election. I am actually somebody completely covered in scar tissue. I am a politician who, with my party, has lost and lost and lost. And I was prepared to do, and frankly, from time to time, say anything to get us to a position where the British people trusted us again and we could win power. That's what I have done. Hate it, sneer at it if you like, but it works. Or something like that.
No, I think that it's refreshing. Talking about someone who has a interesting relationship with the truth, Boris Johnson appears to be back, ish. So we've seen these videos circulate on social media where he backs individual Conservative candidates. He doesn't look very well, frankly, but is he going to? Is this desperate times call for desperate measures, wheeling out Johnson for the last 2 weeks?
Well, we'll see, and I might well be proved wrong tomorrow, but I just don't think he's going to come back in a big way during this election campaign. It's quite funny. I read all this stuff on the papers, and the right-wing papers saying, Boris is coming back, Boris to the rescue. And then I go onto social media, and there's a photograph of Boris's big back on a holiday on a beach in Sardinia with his family. And I think, really, he's got no great compulsion to come back and save Rishi Sunak's skin. He doesn't like Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak doesn't like him. They've been barely in touch at all. I think he will come back, but I think he will come back well after the election. If we have a demoralised and divided Conservative Party trying to fend off Nigel Farage, then the only right-wing politician in the country who can take on Nigel Farage in terms of rhetoric and popularity, Boris Johnson, will be very, very tempted to try to come back to Parliament, maybe in a by-election, and then bring the Conservative Party back together again.
You still think he's an asset?
No, but they do.
Andrew, your essay for the New Statesman this week, available on the newsstands from Thursday, it's chock-a-block with ideas and...
It's incoherent is what you're trying to say.
No, it's not. It's hugely thought-provoking. I'm just wondering where to start. Could you just tell people about this sandcastle analogy? I've never heard it myself. What is it you're talking about here?
So the context is that I still think, I might be the last person in the country to be excited. I still think there's an immensely consequential, very important and exciting election campaign, because I think we're going to end up in an unfamiliar place. We're used to Conservatives on one side, Labour on the other. That's how our politics works. I think we're going to have a centrist government, or a centre-left government, largely centrist government, hemmed in by a rebellion on the right, led by Farage, and to a certain extent, dissent on the left, led by the Greens and others. And the question is holding the centre. That's going to be the question. And therefore, our entire political landscape is going to feel very, very different. But looking at the extraordinary polling for the Labour Party and these massive, massive leads, and, majorities of 200, 300 being talked about airily, and the Conservatives down to sort of 60 or 70 or 80 being talked about airily. I was reading a pollster called James Kangasuriam, who works for Focal Data, and they have developed this interesting theory of the sandcastle effect in politics, which I now realise I subscribe to as well, which is that we are in very, very uncertain, turbulent times when the electorate is more volatile than ever before. Far fewer of us are connected loyally to a single party than ever before. We're likelier to run across the spectrum. And therefore, huge polling success by the Labour Party based on the mood of the country, which is essentially, let's get rid of the Tories. And some people say, let's get rid of the Tories by voting for Nigel Farage and Reform. And some people say, let's get rid of the Tories by voting for the Greens or the Lib Dems or the Labour Party. That is the mood. Labour has brilliantly exploited that, very, very careful targeting on seats and very careful expenditure and so on, and are therefore likely to get a huge majority. That does not mean that they're there for 10 years or 15 years or whatever, because the tide run. So this is the sandcastle theory. I forgot about the sandcastle. The sandcastle is this massive, massive majority created, briefly in this election campaign this summer by the anti-Tory mood. And it looks very, very impressive. But because we live in a situation where the electorate is so much more volatile and fast-moving, the tide can come in just as fast and sweep it away just as quickly. In other words, there is no certainty here at all.
I think you write that in the 1960s, is it about half of us of voting age had a strong affiliation with the political party, and that just doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore, and it's loosening all the time.
Because it's quite a strange argument, is it? It feels counterintuitive in a way to say a party could win an absolutely enormous majority, but yet it might be very hard to govern.
Absolutely. And what it points us to is Labour better succeed in power in making life better for working people. It has to restore the NHS, it has to restore the state education system, and so on. Because if it doesn't, at the time of the next election, this business of Nigel Farage saying, I might well be the next Prime Minister, I'm going to be trying to be the next Prime Minister, everybody hoots with laughter and derision now. It might not look so funny in 5 years' time.
Do you really think so?
I think the right is reorganising. And if you look at the Reform UK, we can't call it a manifesto, their so-called contract with the people. It's really ultra-Toryism, isn't it? It's Toryism on steroids. The Tories want tax cuts. Reform wants massive tax cuts. The Tories want to make savings in the state and civil service. Reform wants to make absolutely massive savings inside the NHS and the civil service. The Tories want to stop the boats. Reform wants to stop the boats in 100 days by flinging migrants back to the French coast, and so on. In other words, it's all appealing to those innate, perhaps slightly darker Tory instincts, but even more so. And therefore, I think over the next few years, if the Conservative Party in Parliament is badly divided, as I think it will be, and demoralised, and Farage and co carry on, they're just much more eloquent, much more. I mean, Farage, compared to Sunak, is a charismatic politician. And that's where the Trump comparison comes in. I can see big changes coming on the right in politics, yeah.
Do you think that if the polls are right, or even nearly right, that we're going to face a bit of a democratic deficit come July the 5th? Because it's possible, isn't it, that Labour could win this so-called supermajority, 200-plus seat majority, on 30% of the vote, and yet
38%, I think.
Okay,
more like. But yeah, your point is absolutely right.
And Reform and Lib Dems could get roughly equal share of the vote, but massive difference in the number of seats that they get. I mean, there's going to be a lot of discontent, isn't there?
So one of the other things I have focused on this week's essay is I think PR or voting reform is going to be one of the really big issues in the next Parliament. And if you're looking for a Labour revolt, internal Labour dissent, I think it'll be on this rather than anything else. Because, again, if you try and imagine what the next Parliament might feel like, you have a huge number of Labour MPs who've got in on first past the post, really ruthlessly targeted first past the post. Then you've got the Lib Dems, maybe with, quite a lot of MPs. I don't think they'll be the opposition party, but they're going to do very well. They might be. And they are very vehemently pro-PR, as are the other parties. You've got reform. Maybe you've got 2 or 3 or maximum 8 reform MPs, but 1 in 5 people in the country might well have voted for reform. That's not fanciful to talk about now. So millions upon millions of people have voted for reform and got almost no MPs. Millions of people have voted Lib Dem and got a few MPs, but not nearly as many as they'd hoped for. And then you've got the Greens and the other parties. So you've got massive pressure for PR. Inside the Labour Party at the 2022 conference, the Labour Party voted strongly for PR. Most of the big unions are pro-PR. I can just see a fissure that's going to be quite hard for Keir Starmer to solder over and ignore in the next Parliament.
Because it will look very different once they're in government. And a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas in a way, isn't it? The existing system will have delivered them this huge majority.
But I haven't even mentioned the Tory party. But, the Tory party will be full of MPs who have been absolutely battered this time by first past the post. And if you want an argument for PR, being battered by first past the post is quite a strong one. So I think it'll be very strongly supported inside the next House of Commons.
You also talk in your essay about Scotland, and we've not been discussing this as much as we have in previous months because we've got to a point in the polls where it seems that actually Labour don't need to take Scotland off the SNP anymore. But
we'll see.
Actually, have we taken our eyes off the ball here?
Yes, we have taken our eyes off the ball. And I'm only reporting sort of gossip and muttering from Labour candidates in Scotland who feel that a Labour Party campaign nationally very much focused on winning over Tory 2019 voters in England does not play so well in Scotland, and they feel relatively undefended while being attacked from their left by the SNP. And the issue that seems to be crystallising around is the 2-child cap. And you've seen Keir Starmer under constant questioning about that. Again, on the Nick Ferrari show, he said, "I'm very, very sorry, but we're not going to be able to lift that." I think they will lift it in the next Parliament at some point, but it is expensive. And I think the worry at the moment in Labour HQ is that after months of talking about Scotland being the route to Downing Street, they might actually not do very well there.
Really? I mean, because they're still looking... I mean, today in the Times, they talk about Labour being positive in Scotland. They're now upping their target to, I think, 36 seats.
So I've seen one poll, which I referenced in the essay, for instance, showing the SNP down at 37 seats from 48. Now, that's a big drop, but it's not the quite sort of catastrophic collapse that some people have been predicting, and still beating Labour. And I don't know. The word on the street is that it's not feeling quite as good in Scotland as Labour might have expected.
The 2-child benefit cap also makes life a bit awkward for Anna Sarwar, doesn't it, who launches the Scottish Labour manifesto
today. Well, he's a vehement opponent of that and always has been. And so I assume what he's going to be saying today is I remain a vehement opponent. It's an awful, desolate, terrible poverty which increases child poverty. And as soon as we can get rid of it, I'm sure we will. But we're going to wait until resources allow.
Yeah, Dale Vince as well, big Labour donor on Newsnight last night, saying
the same
can
thing.
Get rid of this very cruel policy. Bit of a hint from Starmer yesterday on the campaign trail that he's not a fan of it.
And then he pulled back again this morning.
Yeah.
So it is very. I mean, there is real tension inside Camp Starmer, I think, about this policy. There are people around him who would love to see Starmer come out and say, "Do you know what? We are going to raise capital gains tax by a little bit, and we're going to use that money to lift the 2-child cap." But they're not going to get that.